Hi, it's Dennis Daly. I've posted over 100 excerpts from some of my more than 250 American montage shows that I did in the 1980s and 90s while at UPI Radio. Recently, I embarked on a fresh series of shows, and here's the first half of one of my new American Montage interviews. Back in the 1950s, when I was a kid, I used to love to tune into a Western called Sugarfoot, starring an energetic young man named Will Hutchins. Sugarfoot got the name because he was kind of a tenderfoot. He was a Westerner who hated to shoot his guns. He preferred to use his law books. This time around on American Montage, we're going to be talking about early television with Will Hutchins. The first thing I mentioned to him is that everyone in my generation could sing the theme from Sugarfoot. Sugarfoot, Sugarfoot. He said it was written by, of all people, the great movie composer Max Steiner.
He wrote it for a movie called Sugarfoot starring Randolph Scott. He was an entirely different kind of a hero. I was kind of almost an anti-hero, just a reluctant hero. But then the lyrics were written by Paul Francis Webster for the show. We didn't have lyrics the first year, but then we got them the second, third, fourth year. It's one of the more memorable theme songs. But, one thing that really impresses me so much about TV Westerns is every one of them had a great theme song. In fact, I think that's our greatest gift to the world, our music.
Will, I really agree with you there. When you look at the show Sugarfoot and you look at your career, you seem to be a shining example of someone who practically became a star overnight. Can you tell us how all of that happened? How did you go from national obscurity, if you will, to being a major star?
Well, it wasn't hard to find. I grew up in L.A., in Atwater, across the L.A. River before the Glendale Tracks. It's now called Atwater Village.
And I might point out to the audience that in a conversation we had before going on the air, we found out that he and I lived at almost exactly the same place in Atwater Village, but of course not the same years.
But my day was just Atwater, and we used to see a lot of movies being shot in Griffith Park, and that kind of gave us all the bug. We all wanted to be in movies, and some of our classmates in school, you could tell them by their long hair they worked in movies. So when I was in college, I went to college to keep out of the Army as long as possible.
And didn't you at first want to be an English major?
But then along came speech and drama, and I took that. It's a good thing, too, because I'm a very slow reader. I'm sure I would have been shipped over to Korea with bad grades. So after college, I did go into the Army, into the Signal Corps. I was stationed over at SHAPE headquarters near Paris. So I had a wonderful Army career. Then I came out and didn't know what to do with myself, so I went down to the post office to get a job. It was around Christmas time, and I thought I was going to be working a couple of weeks. I wondered why they were giving me all these tests and things. Well, I signed up to be a permanent mailman, didn't realize it. So I didn't want to embarrass them or me, so I became a permanent mailman for a while. Then UCLA accepted me on the GI Bill. I went there as postgraduate work in the motion picture department, which was very primitive in those days. It was a lot of fun working on those student movies at UCLA. And one day there was a show then called Matinee Theater every day at noon on NBC, an hour show live, coast to coast. I wanted to be an editor, film editor, so I stayed up all night at UCLA working on my film, and a buddy of mine came along and dragged me off to NBC to try out for this part. All points bulletin. So I was very sleepy from being up all night, so I crawled under the piano and fell asleep. So I was the last one to go in there, and I noticed when I was doing speech tournaments that you tended to have more of a chance of winning if you're toward the end. The judges remembered you better. So I got the lead, and it was a very bloodthirsty kind of thing. And they put me on 3 more of those matinee theaters. And Warner Brothers saw me, called me over to try just to audition for something. Oh, it was a series called Conflict. It alternated with Cheyenne, big Clint Walker. They were the big hit on the lot. He got all the cogs going in the TV department. He's the guy that caused them to have such a success, I think. So I tried out for this part. Tab Hunter was offered the part, but he didn't want to do it. Thanks, Tab.
I always thought you and Tab Hunter looked alike in some way.
Well, you know what? One of the matinee theaters I did, I played Gene Raymond's son. Remember Gene Raymond?
Oh, sure. And he was married to Jeanette MacDonald. And you know who sang at their wedding?
Nelson Eddy?
Nelson Eddy, absolutely.
Well, the story I heard was they were really in love with each other, but L.B. Mayer wielded a strong scepter on his throne.
And more or less a sledgehammer.
Yeah, and she had to do what he told her, and so she married Gene Raymond instead. I played his son, and so they bleached my hair blonde to match his. And I still had this blonde hair when I did Lafayette Escadrille, the first movie I ever did at Warner's. William Wellman, it was his story of his life in World War I with a flying corps. And his son, William Wellman Jr., played him. I think that's the only time in history that I know of where a director's son played his father in a movie about his father's life. And I had billing over Clint Eastwood, shows you how times change. And I had blonde hair in that, and Bill Orr, the head of Warner Brothers TV, saw that, and he thought that I should just keep that hair blonde. And in those days, they didn't have the system they do now. The bleaching process really ruined my scalp. I was almost scalped without an Indian doing it with a makeup lady. Oh, it really hurt. And I talked them out of it, so as the years went on, my hair was allowed to slowly go back to its natural dirty blonde, which photographed brown. So anyhow, I did this show that Tab Hunter turned down, and it was written by this guy, Monty Pittman, who was he was Shirley Jackson's stepdad. And he was a guy from Louisiana, and he had that natural way of telling tales that Southerners seem to have more than most of us. And he could just write a script in no time, and they made him a director, and he was the most talented guy I've ever worked with. He was just a wonderful guy. And so that show was pretty good. It was Jim Backus played a traveling medicine salesman, a real con artist, and I wanted to join up because it seemed so romantic. But at the end, I got to go back to farming. That's what the country really needs, good farmers. They don't need more con artists. And the guy that directed it was the guy that produced Johnny Carson's show.
Fred DeCordova.
Fred DeCordova, yeah, he was a terrific guy. What goes around comes around. My first job in show business was at NBC, and my last job in show business, sort of, was at NBC. I worked 12 years there in the warehouse. I was a warehouseman. And I'd see Fred DeCordova every once in a while. He always give me a hug and talk to me, and very unlike most people in showbiz.
Well, I remember I attended a roast of the Pacific Pioneer broadcasters. I was there as a guest of voice artist Jimmy Weldon, and they were roasting Fred DeCordova, and I didn't realize what an incredible career he had. And when they talked about The Tonight Show, here's a show that was on 5 nights a week where anything could have gone wrong, and it should have left Fred DeCordova as a bitter old guy with ulcers, but he turned out to be this teddy bear when I interviewed him.
Well, where he reached his peak in show business, when he directed Ronald Reagan in Bedtime for Bonzo. That was the peak of his career.
That was it, huh?
That was it. After that, downhill.
Will Hutchins, Sugarfoot was on during a time when every station you went to had some kind of Western on it. You had made some appearances. You were visible to the people in Warner Brothers, but how did you move from bit player to starring in Sugarfoot, your own weekly show? That must have been quite an experience.
Well, I say I did this conflict. Most of their series up to that time were titles from old Warner Brothers movies. Like they actually had the temerity to do a pilot of, I think it was on the air for a while for a season, Casablanca, with Charles McGraw in the Rick part. And they did Kings Row, my wife's heartthrob, Robert Horton was in that. Cheyenne was based on a Dennis Morgan Western. He got one of the worst reviews I've ever read. It said, Mr. Morgan enters a saloon preceded by his stomach. Ouch, that one hurt. And Sugarfoot was based on, the title was taken from the Randall Scott Western. So I did 4 shows for Warner's on the conflict series, and they were all bucolic, country bumpkin, kind of a funny. One of the shows I got on the horse backwards and thought the tail was his mane, So they thought I'd be a good contrast to Cheyenne, who was the hero of heroes, the most stalwart of all the Western heroes. When he took his shirt off in the gym, he looked like a hairy wall. And so they made sure that he took a shirt off every show. And I take my shirt off once in a while, but I had long underwear on.
Okay.
Quite a contrast.
Well, now, in contrast to that big stalwart image, the character you played in Sugarfoot, if I'm not mistaken, was a lawyer who had taken correspondence school and didn't even want to carry a gun.
He was Reluctant Hero. That was his second title, title of our second show, The Reluctant Hero. He'd ride into town, his saddlebags, his gun and holster would be in one saddlebag, and his law books would be in the other, like the scales of justice. But he was kind of a cop-out. He'd try to do things in the legal way, but at the end he's usually forced to strap on his holster and do the bad guy in pronto without taking him to court.
Will, what was your biggest surprise, the thing you didn't expect when it came to doing a weekly show?
It's sort of a rut. I never got any compliments much, and I sure didn't get much pay. And my mom just accepted me. We watched the show. And we didn't have reruns. We had reruns, but we didn't have those machines to copy them. So we saw them, and that was it. And nobody ever gave me much in the way of compliments on the lot. And some of my friends, most of my friends didn't. So I just thought I was a schlunk. I did a lot of these publicity layouts for fan magazines and stuff like that, but I just thought I was a run-of-the-mill. I never thought much of myself. Maybe that's a good thing.
Well, so many actors sabotage their careers because of their ego.
Don't want to believe your publicity at all.
Will, you talk about lousy pay. You see these stories about people in modern-day television demanding $1 million an episode. In the earlier days of baseball, our favorite stars had to work 2 jobs to feed the family. Low pay for you as the star of a primetime show. How little were you paid?
Because I'd gone to college, my agent got me an extra 100. I got about $250 a week when I started, and that was pretty good pay for those days. But Wade Preston, who was probably the toughest guy on the lot, he did Colt 45. He was a real soldier of fortune, and before Bruce Lee, he could have probably cleaned up with all the other leading men in a fair fight. He was tough. Well, they only paid him $150 a week. Now, sometimes he'd do 2 shows a week. His show was only half an hour. So there was a star of a successful TV Western making, in essence, $75 a show. And none of the guest people got paid that little money.
Right, they were making what was called scale.
Yeah, and we didn't get residuals in those days either. We had a very weak union in those days. Nowadays, Screen Actors Guild is just wonderful. They've treated me just great. But in those days, they weren't led by the best leader in the world, and he sold us out, so we didn't get residuals.
I remember talking to Dennis Weaver one time, and we were talking about all of these television stars who had 1 or 2 or more series, and then were out there playing summer stock and playing Des Moines, Iowa, and Pensacola, Florida. And Dennis Weaver interrupted me, and he said, I've done all of that. It's fun, and I have to eat. And I almost felt sorry for him. It hit home suddenly, the fact that if you're a star and then you're not a star for a while, you still have to pay the bills.
I can't knock Warner Brothers because I've got TCM, and the movies from the 30s and 40s that Warner's turned out were my favorites. They just sparkle, they bubble, they had so much energy. Nowadays, sometimes they take half an hour giving you the credits at the beginning of a movie. They're so slow. I took a great course from Slavko Vorkapich, whose student was the guy that did the great montage of the earthquake in San Francisco. And Vorkapich told us, if you see a shot on the screen, and if it lasts for 10 seconds, and there's no action or anything, it dies before your very eyes.
Well, for example, this is a long-form radio show, and there are people who can't sit still for a long interview. Friends of mine said, well, why don't you cut it up into 10-minute segments? Anyway, this allows you and I to sit here and talk, but you don't hear a lot of that anymore. And in the golden days of radio, there were long shows, but there were also the shorter shows. You had the 15-minute programs, which I know you used to listen to.
I'd stay home purposely. I'd say, I got a cold. I had to hear what happened to young Witter Brown or Our Gal Sunday. I had to listen to those. Then I got to work with those soap opera actors, and they were just tremendous. Geez, they were great to work with, the radio people.
Will, let's talk about that, but don't let me forget to go back to Sugarfoot here in a minute. I knew very little about old-time radio until about 15 years ago.
Uh-huh.
And I regret the fact that all of those times, 20, 30 years ago, I was visiting Los Angeles when many of those actors were alive. I didn't know enough about them to interview them.
Uh-huh.
I remember hiring Paul Frees one time,
Oh, boy, what a voice.
who was in every conceivable radio show. I hired him to do a voice in a public service spot when I worked at the Ag Department. We had lunch together twice. But at that time, I didn't know about his work on Suspense. I didn't know about his work on Escape and the 11,000 radio shows he was in, so I never talked to him about that.
Well, you know, the last thing I did at Warner's was Merrill's Marauders, story of the Merrill's Marauders in World War II in Burma.
Right, and I think they filmed it in the Philippines, if I'm not mistaken.
A Jungle is a Jungle. We shot it in the Philippines. And that was Jeff Chandler's last movie. He got hurt playing baseball one night. I was playing baseball, and he stretched. He was first baseman, and he wrecked his back, which aided his characterization because we were all half dead anyhow, marching through the jungles and over mountains fighting the Japanese. And so he went back home, and he died on the operating table. So he couldn't do a lot of his dubbing, and Paul Frees dubbed Jeff Chandler's voice for that movie.
I think at one time or other, Paul Frees ended up dubbing everybody when it was necessary. He told me his favorite role was dubbing the English part for the Japanese actor Toshiro Mifune in Tora Tora Tora.
Oh, my favorite actor. Oh, I love that guy.
But isn't it a shame how many Americans just can't get into foreign movies, and there's such a wealth of wonderful film out there?
They don't like to read the subtitles, I guess.
Maybe it's laziness.
I think so, because I prefer foreign movies because I know all about the American movies. But one of the great changes in my life was 1945. I was in junior high school, and there was an ad in the paper showing a gal putting on her stocking. And that was really sexy for those days because we had censorship. And it was an Italian actress, and the movie was called Open City. And I can hardly wait till Saturday, so I took a streetcar and a bus, and I transferred all over to get out to the Fairfax Theater in Hollywood, in the Hollywood area, and it's a old, musty old theater, and it's all the better to see a movie because the air is fraught with memories and echoes and imagination. And there I'm seeing a World War II movie not made by Hollywood, and by the people that really suffered while the Nazis were there, and they hadn't been gone that long. Roberto Rossellini, and there's Anna Magnani. And the priest gets killed by the Nazis. He's in cahoots with the communists to fight the Nazis. And I'd never seen anything so real in my life. It just wiped me out. I said, this is the way the world really works. And I hear that Italian language for the first time. And Anna Magnani, she was no glamorous movie star. She was a woman, and she got shot down on the streets by the Nazis. And quite a few years later, they asked us, Academy members and members of the Academy Award, the vote and we're members of the Motion Picture Academy, to put down three of our favorite movie scenes because they use a lot of montages on the Oscars and show clips of different things, the history and all that. So I put down Jimmy Cagney and Bob Hope tap dancing on a table in Seven Little Boys.
Absolutely.
I put Sabu fighting the giant spider in The Thief of Baghdad, and I put Anna Magnani getting shot down on the Rome street by the Nazis. And guess what? They showed the Anna Magnani scene. In fact, the next year they showed it again and made it even longer.
Will, I remember my first introduction to foreign films was actually in college at Indiana University. They showed us Sergei Eisenstein's Potemkin from 1925, and there's one scene where as the battleship approaches, I think, the city of Odessa, there is a woman with a baby carriage, and in all the confusion, the carriage gets loose and goes down the steps with a kind of groundbreaking camera shot as you are right in front of it, and it took my breath away. And then we saw the 1928 film Joan of Arc with Maria Falconetti, and her portrayal of Joan of Arc is said to be probably the most realistic job of acting ever done in the history of movies. And then in a lighter vein, we have British humor, British comedies, which are entirely different in many ways than what we're used to here.
Oh, boy. Do you ever watch Sherlock Holmes on Saturday night.
You mean the series where Holmes is played by Jeremy Brett?
You know, he died in '83. He was alive to us. We didn't know anything about him. He died in 1983, but the show still lived. I mean, they're still young and vital.
Well, it's interesting how a lot of people only remember the Basil Rathbone, Nigel Bruce incarnations of Sherlock Holmes, a dozen movies, and a long-running radio series they did, but people forget about the actor who many people say was really, before Jeremy Brett, the best of all of the Sherlock Holmes actors, and that was a fellow named Arthur Wantner, tall and gaunt, looked like the way we think Holmes should have looked, and did about a half a dozen movies in the 30s before Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce came along. But there have been so many incarnations of that Sherlock Holmes franchise over the years, it's hard to count them.
I know. Well, we love the one on Saturday night. The photography is so beautiful, and the music and the acting is, it's just superb. And we just love that show. My favorite one is, I won't spoil it for you, but if you ever get a chance to see The Crawling Man.
Ooh.
That's my favorite one.
Sounds good already.
Yes. It's about this scientist that's doing these mad experiments down in the lab, like Boris Karloff used to do.
By the way, I recently interviewed Karloff's daughter.
I know, you told me that.
Will, let's go back to your association with and your love of old-time radio. So many wonderful actors and actresses back then, but they were largely anonymous to the audience. I remember Fred Allen one time talking about the bad thing about television. Said when you did a bad show on radio, you could walk home and no one knew you, but if you did a bad show on television, you'd walk home, people would recognize you, and they'd beat your brains out. But a lot of those actors who did so many starring roles in radio in Hollywood were just ordinary-looking people who led their own lives when they weren't on radio and had a degree of anonymity.
Yeah, exactly. And then this Radio Life magazine came out. I think it cost a penny. And, of course, I had to get all those issues, and I was always disappointed. I Love a Mystery, and Michael Raffetto played Jack Packard, the hero. I expected he'd be about 6'3", 200 pounds. He's just a little guy.
And what's really funny is that many of the femme fatales on radio were just kind of average-looking women in real life. They just sounded gorgeous. One of the most wonderful actresses, versatile, was Virginia Gregg. Jack Webb used her a lot, but one week on a radio show, she would be a teenage Chinese servant in a hotel as Miss Wong on Have Gun Will Travel, and the next week she'd be Queen Victoria. She was extremely talented.
Oh, what a wonderful woman.
I think she was one of the most unsung heroines in the history of broadcasting.
I think she did Gunsmoke, too.
Yes, she was on that a lot in a lot of different roles. Miss Kitty was played by Georgia Ellis. And, of course, Matt on radio was William Conrad, who weighed about 280 pounds. And it's a sad story, the way they got rid of the entire radio cast when they went to television so they wouldn't have to embarrass William Conrad. Of course, Chester was played by Parley Bear, one of the most lovable actors of all time. I met him at a Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters meeting, and he had had a stroke, and he was there in a wheelchair, but at least I got to say hello and tell him how much I appreciated his work. I understand that you were able to spend time with and work with Parley Bear.
Both worked as ringmasters in circuses, so we had that in common. And we did a Gunsmoke up at, we do a lot of these radio recreations. They're kind of dying out now, but I used to go to Brockton, Massachusetts, where Rocky Marciano's from, at the Massasoit Community College, and we do these radio recreations every year. And the first year I was there, I got to work with Parley Bear, and we did a Gunsmoke. And his name was on Gunsmoke on the radio was Chester Proudfoot, and on TV it was Chester Good. And I said, well, why the two different names? He said, well, I made that name up. One night we were doing the show live, and Mr. Conrad dropped his script, and I had to keep no dead air allowed. I had to keep going, so I said, yeah, Mr. Dillon, we're going to get those killers. I know you can do it. I'm for you 100%. I know you're going to get those killers and save the Witters Brown's ranch. I know her as sure as my name is Chester Proudfoot.
Well, more than that, he actually ad-libbed the last name, but the middle name. He invented Chester Wesley Proudfoot.
You know, lawyers, they figure they have to earn a living even if there's nothing to do. They for some reason, they had to use a different last name for Chester on the television series.
And you know, the shame of all of this is that radio show broke so much ground. It was such a phenomenon. It had to go to television. But as I said, they didn't want portly William Conrad on a horse, so they got rid of the entire cast.
Well, that might have been fun.
Well, there certainly wouldn't have been anything wrong with it. And, of course, to hype the new television Gunsmoke, they even had John Wayne come on before the first episode and talk about how wonderful it was going to be and how this new Matt Dillon, and God love the new Matt Dillon. I mean, when you look at the wonderful acting over the years James Arness did for 20 years, God bless the television Gunsmoke, but still an embarrassment for William Conrad. And, of course, Doc on Gunsmoke was played by one of the best-loved radio actors of all time, Howard McNear. He ended up being Floyd the Barber on Mayberry, and Parley Bear was the mayor of Mayberry at one time.
You know, my favorite television actor played Doc on the TV series, Milburn Stone.
Yes, I love that man.
Can I tell you a story about that?
Certainly, Will. This time is yours. Go ahead.
Well, this is a weird story. When I was a kid, I'd go to the movies all the time. Well, usually by myself. I'd take my bike. So I went up to Glendale one night and saw Keeper of the Flame with Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. I didn't think the movie was all that great, but there's an opening scene in war-torn Washington. He's in a crowded hotel with this Audrey Christie from the New York actress. And he said, "You want some coffee?" He says, waiter, a cup of coffee. You want some coffee? 2 cups of coffee. And just the way he said that, I thought, my God, I've never seen acting. It wasn't like to be or not to be, but it was so believable. It was so believable. And so I just kept that to myself. I didn't tell them. I didn't go to school the next Monday and tell the fellas about how Spencer Tracy ordered coffee. I just kept it to myself. And years later, I did a rodeo at Camp Pendleton, and Kitty and Doc were there. I'm sure they were paid. And we all had cocktails that night, and we were all sitting around listening to the master, Milburn Stone. Somebody asked him who his favorite actor was. He said, Spencer Tracy. And somebody else said, well, can you name some example of it, what you like about him? He said, yeah, there was a movie once called Keeper of the Flame. And I went, nope. And he's ordering coffee, and just the way he ordered the coffee, and he did it just right. I couldn't do it, but he did it just right. And I thought, my gosh, how's that for some kind of a miracle?
We're talking to early TV star Will Hutchins, who starred in the Western Sugarfoot, about the trials and tribulations of being a television star back when you didn't get paid anything.